Hi everyone, I'm Miranda and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today I'm filming part 2 of my recent reads. So I'm catching you up on all of the books that I read over the summer when I wasn't really YouTubing because I'd just moved and was settling into my new home. I filmed a part 1 a couple of videos back and I'll put a link to that in the description box, but here is part 2 which will catch you up on all of the books that I read over the past few months. So to start off, one of the best books that I read that I'm so excited to tell you about, and that is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. This is a real 20th century classic, but it was one that I'd never read before, though it was on my to-be-read pile for ages, and I'm so glad that I finally picked it up. I'd actually separated out a few books into a bag before I moved so that even when I was unpacking, I'd still make sure that I had plenty of books to read. I carried this bag up in the car to Yorkshire. And I read this on the day of my move, actually. I remember it was such a stressful day because the men who were meant to be moving us were late arriving. I was feeling really stressed out. It was a heat wave in London and it was lockdown, so we couldn't sort of go anywhere cool to wait. We just had to sit in the flat and I was feeling really anxious and I needed some distraction. So I chose this book from the bag of books because it was so slight, and I don't know if any other book could have really distracted me on that day, but fortunately this one really did. I read it in a few hours. Fortunately the movers arrived. So that day had a happy ending, but I managed to read this before they got there and I absolutely adored it. It is one of the best examples of an unreliable narrator that I've ever read, and I love books with unreliable narrators. They're fascinating, and this is exactly the kind of book that would be amazing for a book club because you read it and you just want to talk about it to other people. Unfortunately, it's one of those books I feel I can't say too much about if you haven't read it because I don't want to give away too many spoilers. I didn't know that much about the plot before I approached the book, and I think that's the best way to read it. So I don't want to spoil it for anyone, but if you like unreliable narrators, you would really enjoy this. The story is told through the eyes of Merricat, who is a young woman she's about 18 years old, and she and her sister and their uncle live very isolated lives in a big house that's quite a distance from their local village. And there's clearly some real antipathy between Merricat's family and the local villagers. Merricat is the only one who will actually go out of the family household. Her sister and uncle seem quite frightened of ever leaving the home. And the story starts off with Merricat's trip to the village to buy groceries. She only makes a sort of weekly trip into the village. And at first your sympathies are very much with her, I would say. But as you read the book, you become more and more suspicious of her as a character. And what has happened, you realise, is that years ago, all the rest of her family were killed. They were poisoned at a family dinner, and her sister was actually arrested for the crime but was not convicted. But it's a really fascinating premise to start off this book. Like I said, there's just so much that you want to talk about. People have very different opinions about Merricat, I would say, as well. So yes, if you've never read this, please do. It is such an engrossing read and it stays with you so long after reading it too. Highly, highly recommend this. I also read The Hunting Party by Lucy Foley. This is the perfect type of book if you're just in need of some escapism or a really quick, light read. This would be a really good winter book, actually, because it is set on New Year's Eve and the days sort of immediately surrounding New Year's Eve. It's about it's about a bunch of old university friends who like to celebrate New Year's Eve together every year. This year they've chosen to rent a big house in Scotland, and they all travel up together and look forward to celebrating New Year's Eve together. But the weather turns terrible in sort of classic mystery sort of trope, so they're all cut off from anywhere else, and they end up being completely isolated in this big house in Scotland. And although they're a group of friends, tensions run high, and one of them ends up being murdered. I really enjoyed this. I think Lucy Foley has been quite clever with how she constructs her murder mysteries, because she tweaks the traditional structure of, the murder happening fairly on in the book, and then the whole rest of the book is about finding out who commits the murder. In her books, the murder actually happens right at the end, and by the time the murder happens, you are also aware of who the murderer is and what their motive is too. So she's kind of upended the traditional structure of the murder mystery, although she also updates a lot of the sort of tropes of the typical golden age murder mystery type book, which I really enjoy. So I like how she's done that. She's both written her books as a kind of homage to golden age crime, but she's also twisted some of the tropes quite cleverly too, I would say. There's a character called Miranda in this, which I enjoyed, although she's really not a likeable character, so that was a bit of a shame. But yeah, I enjoyed it as just a sort of light but quite a good page turner type of book, and I would read it over a New Year's Eve. I think that would actually be quite fun to do. Another book that I've been wanting to read for ages and finally did is Lady Audley's Secret by Mary Elizabeth Braddon. I'm so glad I finally got to this. I really enjoyed it. And I would say if you love The Woman in White by Wilkie Collins, then definitely read this. I'm a huge fan of Wilkie Collins, and I reread The Woman in White not that long ago, actually, so it was really interesting to read Lady Audley's Secret, which I felt was almost written in reaction to The Woman in White. I'm sure that Mary Elizabeth Braddon read it, and she definitely copied, I think, some aspects of The Woman in White. This was published after The Woman in White too, and she did copy some of the subplots and ideas from Wilkie Collins's novel, but she made the villain in this a villainess. I mean, there's a wonderful villain in The Woman in White, and she's made her sort of evil character a woman in this book, which I enjoyed that she changed that. It's a bit more unusual to have a woman as the sort of nemesis in a story, and I really enjoyed that, and I felt that she enjoyed playing with a sort of a female baddie, so to speak. Saying that, there is a lot of moralising going on in this too, which you have to expect in Victorian literature, really. But I also felt that she just got a bit of a kick out of being able to write a female character that was quite a bad lot, and that was done really well. I also enjoyed this because I felt there was a very early example of the sort of amateur gentleman detective in this book, and a bit in the sort of Lord Peter Wimsey style. In fact, I wondered if Dorothy L. Sayers had got inspired by this at all. The young man in the book, who's the sort of main protagonist, becomes very suspicious of Lady Audley, who is his wealthy elderly uncle's new, penniless but young and beautiful wife. And his best friend has gone missing, and he connects his friend's disappearance somehow with Lady Audley. It's clear that she has something to do with this man's disappearance, and her past is very mysterious, so he sets out to discover more about her, about where she came from, and he uncovers her secrets. It's a brilliant sort of Victorian sensationalist novel. It's real sort of scandal fiction, but it was such a fun read and I highly recommend it. Another read for me was I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Maya Angelou. This was a reread for me, but it was almost like coming to the story fresh again because I'd read it so long ago. And it was wonderful to return to the first volume of Maya Angelou's autobiography. She's one of my very favourite poets. I absolutely adore Maya Angelou's poetry and her incredible way with language, her incredible voice just comes over in this book so well, and I really enjoyed returning to it. I so admire how she deals with the very difficult subject matter of her childhood and young adulthood in just such a sort of beautiful and also just straightforward way. Maya Angelou was sexually abused as a child by her mother's boyfriend, and it's really hard reading that in the book, but she just handles all of this subject matter so well, and it's just so incredible to know what she became as well, when you realise what she had to fight against too. It's quite a hard read in that way, in some of the subject matter of sexual abuse and also of the appalling racism that she witnessed and also lived with, dealt with on a daily basis as a young Black woman growing up in the Southern American states in the sort of, I think in the 1930s, when there was still segregation and just, appalling racism. But it is just such a beautiful book, and I really want to read her other autobiographies too. I think there are 6 or 7 that she wrote, and I'd really like to read the others because I've only ever read this one. So I sort of reread this to start me off on reading the others. Let me know if you've read any of the other autobiographies as well, and if you enjoyed them, because I'd be really interested to know that. Then another book I read was My Husband Simon by Molly Panter Downs. I mentioned in my previous video on what I read this sort of summer that I read One Fine Day by Molly Panter Downs, which I really enjoyed, and I think that's probably her most famous book, and that was an incredible read. I so enjoyed it. This is not as good, but I still really enjoyed it. It was interesting to read this because apparently Molly Panter Downs had never wanted this book republished. Like I said, it was one of her early works, and I think she became a bit ashamed of it and she never wanted it to be republished. But now it has been, so you get the chance to read it. And I do think it is interesting to be able to compare a novelist's early work with their later work and to be able to chart their progression as a writer in that way. One Fine Day is definitely a much better written book than this, but I think there's still real glimmers of that genius in My Husband Simon. It's a really interesting look at a marriage that it's quite an unhappy marriage. It's about 2 people who were drawn together through a real physical attraction, but throughout their marriage, they begin to realise that they perhaps don't have very much in common and they're very bad at communicating with each other. And the young woman in the marriage is a writer. She was a writer before meeting her husband, and she becomes frightened. She feels that he is somehow negatively impacting her creative energy and her ability to write. And she becomes more drawn to a man who offers her more intellectual freedom, more creative excitement, and more chances at progressing her literary career, or so she feels. The end of the book isn't very definite. It's an interesting ending, and in some ways it's quite a sad book, but to me it was just a really interesting look at a marriage that could have been happy, but wasn't really working. And it was unusual, I think, to depict a marriage based on physical attraction and the possibility of an affair based on intellectual attraction. I found that just a sort of, an interesting idea. So I would still definitely recommend reading this one, even though One Fine Day is definitely her better work. Another book I've been wanting to read for ages is The Blackbirder by Dorothy Hughes. I adored The Expendable Man by Dorothy Hughes. That's a book published by Persephone Books, and it's one of my favourites of their books. So I've been wanting to read more by her for a very long time, but for some reason it took me ages to pick up The Blackbirder, but I'm so glad that I did. I actually thought this would be a really good summer read because a lot of it is set in New Mexico. I spent a long summer in New Mexico when I was young, and I just have memories of this, hot, dry desert climate. And so I thought this would be a brilliant summer read. Well, in fact, it's set in the winter. So there's a really great blizzard scene and a sort of car chase in a snowstorm. It's very dramatic, but it'd be a really good winter read actually too. So that took me by surprise a bit. But yeah, if you want to cozy up with a good sort of thriller in the winter this year, then read this. If you like Mary Stuart, I think you would really enjoy this. It's a sort of about a young woman. It's set during World War II, and she's fleeing from Nazis who believe that she holds some important information. And she flees from New York to New Mexico to find the elusive Blackbirder, who she thinks will be able to help her. It's a really great adventure story. I love Dorothy Hughes' writing. I think she's such a strong writer. I love the character she created in this book, and it reads like a Hitchcock film. He definitely could have made a film from this. Like I said, there's a brilliant train scene at the beginning. There's so much drama and suspense, and like I said, just reading it feels like watching a Hitchcock film. It's just brilliant in that way. So I highly, highly recommend this. I thoroughly enjoyed it. This book was sent to me by Virago. It's called I'm Still Here, Black Dignity in a World Made for Whiteness by Austen Channing Brown. And it was a Reese's Book Club pick earlier in the summer. So I was really excited when Virago published this in the UK in August, I think it came out. And I read it really quickly. It's a very slim book, but I read it sort of one evening. And it was such an eye-opening read. I thought it might be a little bit like Me and White Supremacy by Layla Saad, which I'd read a few months ago, and I interviewed Layla on my podcast. And Layla's book was very much a workbook for people with white privilege who want to explore their white privilege, to understand it, and also to commit to the work of anti-racism. So Layla's book, I would say, was actually very much directed to people who hold white privilege. And I thought for some reason that this book would be a kind of similar thing, but actually it's quite different. For one, it's not a workbook at all. It's not something that that has journal prompts that you work through. It's a memoir, and it's about Austen Channing's own story about, on the one hand, celebrating her own self as a young Black woman and celebrating Blackness and Black culture, and also in labelling whiteness and what that means, and her own discovery of work involved in anti-racism and how she came to understand that that was her calling, so to speak, writing about and speaking about issues surrounding anti-racism and also celebrating Blackness. I really enjoyed reading this. I think it's an excellent book to read if you are someone with white privilege, but also as a woman of colour or a black woman. There is so much to gain from reading this book, and part of my own sort of commitment to anti-racism work is to read more books on this sort of subject, and I would really recommend this as a good book to read if you are also interested in reading around this subject yourself. There was a lot to learn from it. It's really well written and I really recommend it. And then I have been dipping in and out of this book through the later summer. This was sent to me by Penguin, and it's called What We're Told Not to Talk About, But We're Going to Anyway. Women's Voices from East London to Ethiopia by Nimco Ali. Nimco Ali is someone I really respect, really admire. She's an activist. She speaks out about having undergone FGM when she was a child and fighting to stop that from happening to other young women. And in this book, she's really talking to a wide range of women about their experiences around subjects that are generally cross cultures really taboo, and that generally deal with the sort of female body and the female experience in some way. So she talks to women whose voices are normally not heard, are normally really marginalized, and I think she just does an amazing job obviously at getting these women to feel comfortable at drawing out these stories and about sharing about subjects that just aren't written about, aren't spoken about much at all, and showing why it's so important actually to speak about these things, to read about them and to understand them. I find for me that this is one that I've been kind of dipping in and out of, not really reading it in chronological order, but more sort of reading it by subjects and things that sort of interest me. I also find it's, some of the stories are really raw, really hard hitting. They require a bit of time to sort of digest and process afterwards. So for that reason, it's a book that I've enjoyed kind of reading quite slowly and thinking about as I read it. But I like having more than one book on the go at a time. So I always quite enjoy having a kind of non-fiction book on the go too, that I can maybe read a bit more slowly than some of the fiction books. But yeah, really recommend this one too. And then I was sent this book from Dialogue Books, which is a publishing company that I really love and love to work with. And this is called Frying Plantain by Zalika Reid Benter, and who is a Canadian author, which I think is great because I'm half Canadian. So I was excited to read this book, which is set in Toronto, I think in the sort of early 2000s, that kind of time. My parents actually went to the University of Toronto. I've been there myself, so it was great to return to the city in fiction. But in this book, Zalika Reid Benter shows a sort of different side to Toronto than the Toronto I would have experienced, in that she talks very much about the sort of Jamaican culture in Toronto. This is a sort of coming of age story about a young girl with Jamaican ancestry and how she comes to terms both with her own identity as a Jamaican, but also as a young woman growing up in Canada, and what those two things mean and how they conflict and how they complement each other, how they make her who she really is. It's very well written and very well told through a sort of series of little vignettes that make up a kind of bigger picture, bigger story as a whole. It deals a lot with mother-daughter relationships, both the good and the bad, and also about sort of grandmother and granddaughter. But yeah, I really enjoyed it and recommend it. As well as The Hunting Party, I read The Guest List by Lucy Foley, which I also really enjoyed. I think I liked The Hunting Party the best of the two. This one is a better summer read in that it is set in the summer. It's about a wedding party, and the guests of a wedding get trapped on a remote island off of Ireland, and a terrible storm blows up, so they're all trapped on the island and a murder happens. So very exciting. And I did enjoy this, and it was a really good page turner. I think it was maybe, like, it is quite similar in setup to The Hunting Party, and elements of the plot of The Hunting Party I felt came into this book too. So that was my sort of one criticism of it, was that because I'd just read The Hunting Party, I was able to predict a lot of the plot twists in this, because I actually felt they were quite similar. However, like I said, I really enjoy Lucy Foley's structure to her books. Again, the murder happens right at the end of this, and by that point you know who's going to be murdered, you know who the murderer is, you know their motive, and it's quite fun to puzzle all those things out through the course of the book. And yes, again, this was just a fun, light page turner, so if you're in the mood for that, this would be a great read. It's a good holiday, airplane type of book, but also if you're just maybe struggling to concentrate a lot on reading at the moment, then something quite engrossing and light like this I think would be a really good call. And then finally, I read Midnight Sun, the new book in the Twilight series by Stephanie Meyer. It was really fun to return to this, actually. I first read Twilight, I don't know, I must have been in my late teens or very early 20s, I can't quite remember, but it was fun to read this, and it sort of brought me right back to that time in my life, and studying so much at the time, and the sort of rather useless high school and university boyfriends I had at that time, and it just sort of brought it all back. So it was quite entertaining in that way for me, and that it was quite a sort of nostalgic read. And I'd always liked Twilight the best of all of that series, and that's the one I remember the best, which is quite good, because this is a retelling of the book Twilight, but from Edward's perspective rather than Bella's. And if you also sort of read the books when you were young and you enjoyed them, then I think it's quite fun to return to them with this book. In all honesty, it really could have been better edited. I mean, it's massive and it's really repetitive. When I read it, I was like, is Twilight as repetitive as this? But I mean, it can't be, just because it's about half the size at least, I think. But essentially, this book is just about Edward, who's a vampire, endlessly worrying that he's going to accidentally kill or harm the love of his life, Bella, who is human. And he really just plays over these fears over and over and over and over and over again in the book. So some of that really could have been edited a bit more, I feel. But saying that, it was fun. I read it really quickly, even though it's huge, because it's a really easy, really light sort of read. And I mainly enjoyed it just because it brought back a certain time in my life and was kind of a nostalgic read for me. But it was also quite fun to read it right at the end of August, and with the start of September, back to school kind of feel being in the air, because this is essentially a high school book and it starts with a new high school year. So it's quite a good time of year to read this, and I enjoyed it for that reason too. But anyway, I think I've now caught you up on all of the books that I read over the past few months. I hope you enjoyed my recommendations. Let me know if you've read any of these, or if you find any of them particularly appealing sounding. I'd love to know. But thanks so much for watching. Do give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and you can subscribe to my channel by clicking my face, I think pops up somewhere around here. But yes, thanks again for watching, and I'll be back again very soon with another video. Bye!